So thank you all for being here this morning, the last day, especially after NACIS night out. It's good to have a good crowd here. So I'm going to talk to you today about a project, as many people have been saying, a project in process. This is still very much at the front end, and it grows out of a program I'm in this year in our Special Collections Library at University of Georgia on how to bring the archives into the classroom, and a new class I'm going to teach called Maps in the City that I'm teaching this spring, so that's part of the process here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, provide just a little bit of background. Some of this is going to be review for some of you, things that you know, but just to contextualize what I'm trying to do with this particular class, and then spend a fair amount of time just kind of talking about the structure of the class as it currently exists. Welcome any input that you all have. So as we know, as we've been reminded already, maps and power have a lot to do with one another. If we can think about maps, it's not just presenting an objectively existing world, but rather creating it and reinscribing it in particular ways to use the power of maps. You know, Dennis Wood's assertion that maps make propositions that this is there, right? And that they assert a certain kind of understanding of the world. And I think we can also then think about them as propositional heading into the future. You know, this should be there, which should be. So we can think, certainly when we think about cities, we think about, you know, the HOLC maps, which recent research suggests they certainly weren't as deterministic as some people might think they were, but they certainly presented a certain kind of logic of how we understand urban space and real estate and financial risk. The maps on the right, Charles Booth's poverty maps of London might be a little less familiar, but are really the root of where things like redlining maps came from. These were maps, if you read the legend, and I'm gonna look really close, like the top one says lower class vicious criminal, right? So like you've got these like tags for these different social groups and where they existed. If you've read Du Bois's Philadelphia Negro, this is where he is working from for his work as well. So you have these maps that label urban space. You have maps that are propositional heading, you know, in terms of looking forward. Daniel Burnham's plan for Chicago, which didn't quite come to pass in the way he envisioned it, but certainly envisioned Chicago as a certain kind of orderly space, right? So we can think about maps that way. And I think taking that critical cartographic understanding, right, and thinking about what that means for the type of work we do as cartographers, as instructors in the classroom. This is a recent chapter called Shaking the Base Map by Judith Madeira. I'm just going to read the quote here. It's a little bit of words, but it's valuable. The very construct of a base map, a selected arrangement of geographic data that constitutes a map setting, depends on the notion of a stable referent. That is, that map reflects a reality. The base map accords value to projected framework for spatial epistemology, but it is nonetheless contingent and reflective of the leverages of power. Who's making the map? What vision do they have? Who's included in that vision? For the wider work of Black geographic praxis, the base map is an index of who gets to control scale, borders, and vectors, and whose interests imposed standardizations serve, right? Who is this map for? And who gets to determine where the lines fall? So with that in mind, I am teaching this class in the spring called Maps in the City that very much engages with these kinds of questions. And it's going to include a substantial portion for the 14 weeks, actually, we shortened our semester, for the 14 weeks in the UGA Special Collections Archives. This is going to dovetail very nicely with especially the first two presentations that we had today. So why use the archives? Certainly there's an effective power of just working with printed maps and materials. I've had this actually is working with some maps related to urban renewal. You'll hear more about this in a second. We've seen all these maps online. Going to see them in person and touching them and seeing the handwriting is a whole different experience, right? So actually just working with primary materials has a certain kind of effective power. The value of primary research as a learning technique. So rather than teaching about all these maps, let's go and take some of these. Some of them have not been part of any research, and think about like, what do we get out of this, right? Where are the threads that are intriguing to us? What mysteries do we want to try to solve with them? The other thing that's really interesting about archives, and I'll talk more about this once we get into this class a little more specifically, is that the maps don't exist in a vacuum. At a basic level, the maps that we're working with are always in an actual folder with other maps or other items, or there's boxes of materials that are in the same collection that are related to them as well. And so you can start to situate maps within a particular context, both in special collections, but also historically as well. It's a great opportunity to develop close map reading. So like one of the things that you'll see we do in a second is you just stare at the map for 10 minutes and talk about what you notice. I think the playing cards were great for that. Like you just have to notice what's here and what choices were made about it. And also to think about like why were those choices made? What purpose does this serve? And then lastly, of course, we have to think about the archives themselves as a particular historical and socially situated place. How do these materials come to be here? What's here? What's not here? Whose voices are represented? Whose voices are missing? And so it's a great opportunity to think about the way that knowledge gets constructed in a very kind of concrete, spatial way. So the program that I was in, the Special Collections Fellows Program, drew extensively from this website called teacharchives.org. I'll just point you here if this is something that seems of value to you. They've got lots of great resources there about how to teach with the archives. And so a lot of the techniques that I'm using are kind of coming out of that, as well as active learning strategies, things like that. All right, so let's turn to the class. So this is a new course that I'm teaching this spring. Same thing, I'm just going to read the description that I've got here for you. The main goal of this course is to help students think about the social purpose that mapping and spatial analysis have had in shaping urban life and landscapes. They'll be gaining knowledge about the history of maps in urban planning and social research, as well as background in counter mapping and the current ways that maps are used by governments and nonprofits. They'll sharpen their critical thinking and reading for both secondary and primary sources, particularly their ability to think critically about maps and cartographic design. Another way to think about this, we have a lot of classes in our department that are about like GIS and data analysis and cartography. We don't have a single course about critical cartography. That's why I wanted this to be, basically. It's like, how do we think about the role maps play in society? It's not a course that we're going to do a lot of GIS. I'm now thinking we might do some paper circuits. But like, it won't, anything they do will be very hands-on analog, not designed for people who to use GIS for it. I'm not going to get into too fine detail. I have a QR code at the end if you want to find these slides and look a little bit more of the details of the course. You can do that. Basically, we're going to kind of cover the basics of critical cartography, look at some older versions of urban redevelopment maps. A lot of these are going to be about how we change the city, how we make a better city. We'll do a first encounter. I'll talk about that in a second. Talk about more historical maps from the early 20th century, redlining, zoning, get into qualitative GIS, do another 3 weeks in special collections, and then talk about things like counter mapping, indigenous mapping, ways of mapping otherwise, essentially. With this, as well as maybe some like current trends stuff. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in on just the week 4 and week 10 here. There's a lot of text on this slide. I won't cover all of it, but it's just doing a close reading of old maps. So the idea behind a first encounter in the archives is you go and just get used to the space and you just think about what is the archives, how does it work? If we get lucky, we'll go down to the air-conditioned basement that it's at 50 degrees or something like that, and it's got 500,000 boxes of materials in it, and that's just fun for students to be able to get to see. But also like let's just look at maps and see what we notice, and particularly, just for like, this is a place to also capture their attention. You're thinking about what are some really cool old maps that they can just look at, right, and observe. So I'll stick with this. This is one that I really like. It's from Savannah in 1852. Not that old in all the scheme of things, but it's kind of old. And you can't really see very much, but I mean, you could just think about here what you might notice about the city, what's on here. I don't think this map, I have to go back and look at it again, I don't think it has a legend. So like, what are the meanings of the various markings that are on the page? There's certain places that are labeled. What were those places, right? There's things that you can sit with this for a second. If we go back and look at some of these questions, what was this map used for? What's missing? What do you like about how it's designed? What questions could you ask with it? Like these kinds of things that are just kind of more cartography 101 kinds of things. Of course, we have to look at Sanborn maps. We've heard a lot about Sanborn maps. We'll look at Sanborn maps, right? So that's the first week. And actually also, like, I was in the UK over the summer. I bought some maps from a shop there in Spitalfields Market that we'll look at in class too. So they'll have opportunity to kind of handle these things. The second one is a little bit of a deeper dive. So they're going to basically work toward creating a map exhibit. They're going to start with map from a particular urban renewal project in Athens, Georgia, that I'm working on right now, and then move on to some other maps and do some stuff with it. Again, a lot of text, have to keep moving. So the R51 urban renewal project is something I'm looking at right now. If anybody knows Athens, downtown Athens, it's right here. We're talking about roughly 400 homes, something 500 plus people were affected by this redevelopment project. There's a ton of records, maps, and also other materials. So this is just a basic, map of the redevelopment, the houses that were there, things like that. But we'll start with this map and just ask questions about what we notice. There's a few other ones they might work with about what's highlighted, what stands out about the map design, who created it, what makes it useful, what's missing, what questions do you have? Kind of just what do you see here? Just to encounter the map as its own in isolation. But then we can start looking through files and look at other materials related to the same project. I actually love this pairing of photos. These are two news stories about the project. This is the guy who is directing urban renewal, a guy named Paul Hodgson, talking about a housing project that was going to be put up that is now ironically being torn down at this very moment, as well as a picture of that destruction. And I think the comparison of those two is striking. There's news stories about urban renewal and its impact on households. With progress comes problems. There's telegrams. So this is a telegram from the governor, Herman Talmadge, to the city of Athens, the executive director of urban renewal, about, hey, the money's coming, right? Like telegrams. That's cool. But it's also like it situates this as a real thing. And then there's photographs of the neighborhoods and of the particular houses that were torn down. And budgets, some of which are typed, some of which are scraps of paper. And we think about how each of these changes our understanding of that map, what it's doing, how it's contextualized. Right? So you spend some time just with that, and then they're going to look at some other maps. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but Techwood Homes, first housing project in Atlanta, there's this cool in a social sciencey awful way about all the maps that were done. This is homes presenting problems of juvenile delinquency, dependency, or neglect, and mapping that prior to the creation of these projects. This is a WPA thing, looking at Athens public housing. The Olympics in 96 were a huge thing in Atlanta, so looking at materials related to that. Various other maps that were about improving the city and also doing some similar contextual analysis where they have to go find those materials and think about pulling those in and how would they situate these maps. And I'll end with kind of right now, my outcome with this is to start thinking about map collage as a way to take these maps and understand them, revision them, right? So this is a project that a master's student of mine did, Vanessa Raditz, on queer climate vulnerability. Vanessa's great. They're a visual artist and filmmaker, and so they took this map in the middle that's about like climate vulnerability for queer populations and put these organizations who are working on these issues, images that were provided by those organizations all around it in a way that makes that map not just about the data, but gives it a kind of vitality and life, right? It reframes that map in some way. So how might we take these maps and take some of these artifacts and visually work with them? What that's going to look like, I think, similar to I'm thinking about the course that Megan just described, that could look a lot of different ways. It could be as simple as just doing cut and paste and scissors or whatever, but I'm not sure, and that's something we're going to work out with students. And so I'll close with this quote from the end of that same article by Judith Madeira at the beginning. By shifting the viewpoint or frame of reference for a map, alternative configurations become more prominent. This element of perspective shifting connects to another feature of counter-cartographies. They expand the stories that maps can tell. They are modes of acting, writing, and recreating place that destabilize exclusionary representations. By realigning spatial claims and representations, counter-cartographies denormalize official maps. They flip the script. right? And so part of the goal here is how does this encounter with the archives change your understanding of what maps are, what they do in society, and for folks who are going to maybe go into fields where they're using these maps professionally, how does that change the kind of practice they want to engage in the future? So with that, I'll stop. There's a link here to slides if you want to see that. I don't know if I have time for questions.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I guess I want to ask this maybe of both you and Megan, but I struggle, I think, in these kinds of spaces where we've inherited a kind of course structure and a kind of style of teaching GIS that's in a classroom with computers in front of the students.
Mm-hmm.
Both of what you're doing is kind of breaking some of the conventions around how we teach students spatial thinking and spatial representation. And I often wonder if it would be easier were we in an art college or an architecture college where we could actually rethink these classes as 6 credit hour courses that might provide opportunity for team teaching, that would allow more marination with fellow students around some of these topics. I don't know if you've had any thoughts about how to kind of break out of this 3 credit hour structure maybe, or if that's even something you'd be.
Yeah. So just to reiterate, because I know we're also having to think about the video here, the question is basically like, is the 3 credit course in a geography program that's primarily GIS classes too limiting, too constricting, and can we kind of break out of that? Just a, I think, a fair summary. That's not a question I've fully, I think spending time in the archive certainly is a way to think about how to make this more experiential. And I know, to me, I think like moving to more of a studio model, like after NACIS, I'm thinking more about that. I teach my community GIS, my service learning class, is more of a studio kind of thing, and not having that like sense of like there's a lab assignment. When we talk about ungrading, you can be much more flexible about how you do assessment with ungrading. I thought about stuff like that. And more credit hours is good. I think the collaborative part of it would be important. Like, what would it mean to teach this class with 2 other people? I don't know if, Megan, if you want to say anything, if you want to come up here, you can talk. Post-tenure, yeah, that's when we start rocking the boat.
Like structurally, I don't think it would work.
But yeah, cool.
This is a poorly formed question because I'm still thinking about what.
It's a poorly formed presentation, so there you go.
One of the things that this also applies to Megan's presentation. When I'm thinking about trying to work with creative ways of thinking about maps, one of the things you get in art schools is trying to develop a sense of voice,
Mm-hmm.
the creator's sense of voice. And one of the things when you're talking about power structures is the critical cartography critiques the voice of power and authority pressing down and
Right.
so forth. But how do you define then what is the alternative? What is the other kind of voice you can have? How can you have a voice that isn't doing that and is doing a map? And so I'm wondering if it just strikes me that's a rich potential way is thinking about performance rather than about documentation and about
Yeah, I'd say, so the question is basically like, whose voice are you seeing in the archives when we look at these maps and thinking about maps and voices? There's a whole literature on archival silences, right? And I think there's good models of how to think through that. I think in this case, some of these other ancillary materials that situate the projects that we're looking at, and there's crazy stuff in these files, either these marginalia on like home report things of like so-and-so refuses to move out or isn't gonna pay. There's actually like pages and pages of handwritten daily logs of phone calls that were made. So there's ways that you can understand how the people on the ground, even if it's being reported by those who had the power in that situation, how they were responding. I'll say just one other quick thing. There's a great book out of UGA Special Collections called Seen Unseen about the daily lives of people who were enslaved on this one family's set of plantations in Georgia. And they relied on letters from the family talking about these people, right? And they're reporting so-and-so is doing this, and so-and-so asked for this, and he escaped, and blah, blah, blah. So like, there's ways, you have to be creative. I don't know if that fully addresses.
We'll talk about it.
Yeah, okay. Sounds good. Clancy had a question too?
Shan,
Yeah,
I have a question for you and also Megan. This is really
we're a good team.
But one of the questions I have is and trying to convince them to be creative or critical in their thinking. Have you found any ways of actually managing that kind of other movement? I think something about it has to do with the seduction of technology, where
Yeah.
you go into an archive, it's messy. You go into a studio kind of space, it's messy. You go into a code space, and it's very clean.
Yeah.
Very didactic. I just want to get, have you got any kind of experience of tips or?
I'm going to let Megan, do you have thoughts on this? I mean, I think I get, so some of it, also like the way we teach mapping in GIS is so structured and so like do this, this, and this. So some of it has to do, coming back to, I think, Matt's question, like the way we do GIS teaching is mainly like we don't want students to come like complain to us about they don't know what to do. Right? And so like if you gave students more space to have to struggle on like how to do something in QGIS, then they would be maybe less resistant because they're used to having to adapt versus having these ordered or regimentary things. I mean, I think that's about like changing the way we do all that instruction and giving them things that get them everybody out of their comfort zone. But I'm guessing you have thoughts on this? Yeah. Okay. I can try to move. No, this is not going to move. You just come up here.
Yeah, I was just going to say, folks with mapping experience are often the hardest because of the way we've been, these structures and way we teach. And so the sketchbooks have been fantastic, where they resist the sketchbook very adamantly, but like forcing everything to go in there, and like they're just like, you can't erase, you can't tear out pages, you can't do whatever. And so what I actually find is students that take like the advanced technology of like, oh, I know Arc Pro, so I'm gonna do this like cool, sexy thing, but then like there's no way it's gonna look like Aunt Knowles, then they become frustrated. And so just getting folks to think outside of like, okay, then how do you backtrack and how do you make that work? And so, yeah, it's TBD, still figuring it out, but yeah, I think sketchbooks have helped.
I think the other thing that could happen with that is like, there's a certain peer element or classroom community element is like when students start seeing what's possible when other people do it,
Yeah.
that's also convincing to them to like, oh yeah, like this there's something here that I could be worth trying, and giving them space to fail, right? So like they could, if they try it and they don't know what they're doing, that it can still be okay in your grading scheme, right?
Totally.
Like,
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, that goes back to the question of grading and like being very transparent about like what this is gonna look like, and having it be either, you know, fully ungraded, contract grading, or, you know, at least spelling out what I'm looking for. And, you know, encouraging people to get feedback along the way. I can intervene much earlier if people ask questions. And so making a space where that can happen is hard, but yeah, thanks for the question.
yeah.